Hi, welcome to All Access at Film.Music.Media.com. I'm Joe Kraemer, and today we're going to talk about my work on Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, probably touch on Jack Reacher, Way of the Gun, and a bunch of other stuff I've scored that you've never heard of or seen. I hope you enjoy it.
Joe, thank you so much for inviting me here to your studio and sitting down, and I really appreciate your time. So to start off, let's go back. I know we've interviewed in the past before, but let's go back to the beginning and talk about growing up. What was it that got you interested in this field and got you interested in composing in general?
There were two factors. One was...
Sorry.
No, that's good. I just want to make sure that's usable. Okay,
yes.
Great. Well, there were two factors. One factor was, as a kid, I loved Star Wars and Superman and Raiders, and so I had those soundtrack albums because I loved the music from them. My father was an amateur musician. He wrote songs. He and my uncle would record songs at home using reel-to-reel recorders and ping-ponging between decks to sort of build up fake multi-track recordings. So I grew up in an environment where people were writing music and performing music, and I just thought it was second nature.
Yeah.
That's what... And the films are what got me interested in the music.
Right.
My love of music and my love of these movies is what sort of turned me on to film music.
Right.
As a fan and a listener. As a composer, what got me into it was when I was in junior high school, I met a senior at the school named Scott Storm, and Scott was making films on Super 8, feature-length independent films on Super 8, and he cast me in one of them as an actor.
Okay.
Because I was in the drama club.
Right,
And so, very early on in the shooting of this movie, I asked him what he did for music in his movies, and he explained to me how he used stuff from his record collection, Tangerine Dream, or Peter Gabriel, Philip Glass, some Led Zeppelin. And so I said, well, don't you get in trouble if you try to screen these? And he was like, well, it's independent film to get away with it, but it'd be awesome to have custom-made music for my film. I just don't know anybody who can do it. And I said, well, I have a studio at home. Maybe I could do it. And he was like, no way. So we tried it on this movie, and it worked. And so at 15, I scored a movie, which, was pretty cool for me. And then that was the summer and fall into like end of 86 into 87. Mm-hmm. Then he went to School of Visual Arts in New York, and one of his roommates or classmates was Brian Singer, who was going there from New Jersey. And they became friends, and they would come up to Albany on the weekends and shoot their student films in Albany because they wanted their films to look different than all their classmates who were filming them in Manhattan or Central Park.
Yeah. So
I met Brian when I was maybe 16, and so somewhere in there, Scott made a second film on Super 8 in which Brian was one of the lead actors and I was the other one. Brian had never acted in a movie before and sort of wanted to experience it.
Yeah.
So he knew what actors were going through when he was directing them.
Right.
And I did the music for that movie as well. And throughout high school and early college, I would sometimes do little pieces of music for the guys for their film school projects, film class projects. And then when it came time to go to college, I just sort of looked at, my options. I loved acting and I loved music, but in the end I decided to go with music. First of all, I thought that what I was good at in music was more distinctive than what I would have brought to the table as an actor.
Right.
And the other thing was I just didn't want to sort of have to compete based entirely on my appearance. You know what I mean? As a composer, who cares what you look like, really?
Right.
But as an actor, it's everything.
Right.
And I didn't want to be like perfect for a part, but lose out because I was an inch too tall.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So once I decided to pursue music, I looked at a bunch of different colleges, and Berkeley in Boston was the most appealing to me because they had recording studios.
Right.
And they had a sort of, their catalog advertised a more rock and roll friendly environment than, say, a conservatory,
Yeah.
And I went and interviewed with the admissions people there and got into school. And I went there to really be like a singer-songwriter, like a Paul McCartney sort of, band leader, if you will, pop band, rock band.
So the whole film music thing kind of faded into...
Well, I mean, I had done it, but I never considered pursuing it. You know, what I did as a film composer in those days was very simple compared to like what John Williams was doing. You know what I mean? I had no understanding of like beat sync or timing, you know, counting frames, and I had no equipment with which to do that. You know what I mean? Like, if you didn't shoot a film on Super 8, the only way you could edit would be to like cut from one VCR to another, which put like a big rainbow stripe on every edit.
I mean, and
it's unwatchable. You know what I mean? So equipment was so primitive that I just didn't, you know, I had no craft. It was all instinct, and I just didn't think to take it very seriously. It was fun, and I enjoyed doing it, but I didn't think I would ever be qualified to pursue that as a career. But when I got to Berklee, and frankly, I also didn't know that Berklee had a film music program.
Oh, okay, wow, yeah.
So when I got there and I discovered they did, I became interested. And as I did more research, it turned out you couldn't do their film music program without declaring it as your major.
Okay.
And it also turned out that I could take most of the courses I wanted in the songwriting program without declaring that as a major. So essentially, I majored in film music and minored in songwriting. Okay. And that got me access to the studios as a performer rather than a producer, so I could still record demos or, you know, songs, you know, multi-tracks. But then I also had all this experience learning conducting and orchestration and techniques in composing and stuff like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's a long journey there.
Yeah, you know, and so while I was at Berklee, Singer won Sundance with his film Public Access. He won a Grand Jury Prize. And so as I was finishing up Berklee and getting ready to move to Los Angeles, he was getting Usual Suspects up and running. So it was during those days in the 80s working with Brian that I first met Chris McQuarrie.
Right. He's now one of your biggest collaborators.
Right. Well, Chris drove Brian from New Jersey up to Albany sometimes to shoot this Super 8 movie. Right. And so, you know, we became friends very early on back then in the 80s. And then throughout the years, we crossed paths and kept in touch. And so when I moved to LA in 94, Chris lived right around the corner from me. And since I didn't have a car, he drove me everywhere. And we just sort of would talk about movies and music and everything. And we just realized we had a lot of the same tastes and a lot of the same instincts. Right. And sort of decided that if we could, we'd work together someday. Wow. So
you moved to LA to pursue a career and everything and to start a career. And when you're a composer and you're doing that, and I mean, you've done a lot of films and I mean big films and everything, but in those early years when you're young and you have this kind of, I guess maybe a little bit of an ego, maybe you're like trying to develop a sound. Is it how do you develop a sound? Like, is it just, do you look at yourself like, I want to be classical, like traditional composer, I want to be modern? Were you in that process? Do you ever go through that process of I want to be, this is what Joe Kraemer is going to sound like, this is what my music is going to be, or did you just kind of just look at the projects and just kind of decided like what's right for it, or did you want to have like a brand sound?
I do think, just as an abstract idea, as an academic philosophy, you've got to do what's right for the movie. Right. Part of being a film composer is adapting to what the movie needs. Right. So if I was, you know, given the chance to score say a Tron movie or a sequel to Blade Runner or something like that, I would probably, my instinct would be to go in a more synthesized direction. Right. In keeping with the original films, but also, you know, the sort of visual landscape of those movies lends itself to a synthesized feeling.
And that's on a stylistic level, but you do have a sound, and I mean, I can hear it through Jack Reacher and Mission Impossible, and you have the sound even in Dawn Patrol. I mean, movies that are different approaches and everything. So how does that language, I guess, start out, those kind of techniques and stuff that you sort of built into your, I guess, database of
sure. Well, I mean, we all have a toolbox that we rely on to get through jobs. You know what I mean? And to me, a lot of our job is problem solving, which is that, you know, I need to score this moment and I need to score this moment. The moments in between, they don't need music so much, but it's too short for me to duck out and come back in. So I have to figure out a way to stay there without getting in the way. Like, that's just one example of a problem you have to solve. Another problem might be that this is a scene where a character is very sad, but the actor just wasn't in the moment on the day. And they're sort of going through the motions, but it's missing that power when it's played without music. And so I've got to help support that and bring that out so that a very small twitch in the actor's face might be read as something much bigger if the music sort of swells at that moment. Another problem might be continuity, that things, don't feel connected when you watch it without music. And then once you put the music in, it sort of glues it together.
Right.
A specific example of something like that would be Mission Impossible, Rogue Nation. From the moment where the characters go to Blenheim and sort of capture the Prime Minister, spoiler alert, until the foot chase starts through London, one concern was that the movie felt like it had all these different moments that felt like endings. So when Tom pulled the mask off, they were afraid that I guess at one test screening they thought it was like, oh, that's the end of the movie now. Now we know the whole plot. The story's over. Right. So there was this directive to keep the music going and never make it feel like the movie's ending. Make these feel like reveals that are heading towards an ending.
Right.
So that's a problem, so to speak, that the score had to solve.
Wow.
So where do these tools come from? It just comes from years of experience. You know what I mean? I suppose it starts... Probably my two biggest influences as a symphonic composer are John Williams and George Martin, who produced the Beatles.
Right.
So if you can imagine a mix between Star Wars and Superman the movie and I Am the Walrus and, let's say Sgt. Pepper, A Day in the Life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you can imagine what those things mixed together in a little kid's head create...
Right.
You might have some idea of where I was at in my headspace. Now, when I started doing scores for Scott, I only had like an 8-bit sampler, the Mirage, and I had like a Casio CZ101 and a 4-track.
Yeah.
I had no way to synchronize to film. We would just watch it and sort of eyeball it. Sometimes I would sort of Morricone it and do the music first. He'd tell me I need something sad. It's about 2 minutes long. And then I'd give it to him and he'd rock and roll it till it felt right and then record it to the film.
Yeah.
Because Super 8 film had the soundtrack right on the film. Right. So you actually had to record it to the film. And through a fluke of technology, if you recorded something... it wouldn't completely erase what was underneath it, so he could sort of cheat and get 4 tracks out of the left and right, plus the overdub, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was a total cheat, and if you screwed up, you were kind of... That was the big thing, too, back then, is if you screwed up, you were kind of stuck with the mistake. You couldn't really go back and fix it. So back then, my tools were much simpler, simpler sounds. There wasn't really the technology or the facility to do anything even sort of remotely believable as a live orchestra using samples.
Yeah.
So rather than sort of sound like a, beep, 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 trumpet, I would just do pads and acoustic guitar because I played guitar and I had a pretty good piano sound and stuff like that. So I could do simple, more chambery sounding stuff or sort of Peter Gabriel type synthy stuff. So that was the language, I guess, that I went into film composing with. And then when I got to Berklee and I started really discovering how John Williams worked and discovering how orchestral music worked, I really got into it. And it was late in my time at Berklee when I met another student who would do mock-ups. And it never occurred to me to try to do a mock-up with a synth setup. And so after I graduated, I was living at home with my folks over the summer to save up money to move to LA. And I had copied a ton of stuff from the library at the school before I left to study. So I had the conductor's score to Close Encounters, and I loaded that into my dad's music system, which by this point was computer-based, and, studied the orchestration line by line. The flute, the piccolo, oboe, clarinet, English horn, blah, 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 straight on down the staff. Pines of Rome, Hoedown, a bunch of different pieces, some Appalachian Spring, stuff like that. And studied the orchestration and also started to sort of contemplate how am I going to be able to do believable orchestral sounding scores on a synthesizer.
So let's talk about, we've talked about building your sound and everything, and I want to kind of move that towards collaboration, which you have, I think, one of the most awesome director-composer collaborations with Chris McQuarrie. And you guys have done, how many films now? It's been...
Three. Plus a TV pilot that we did, which he wrote and produced.
Right. Because, he writes a lot more than... he's kind of getting more into directing now than...
he started in the business as a writer. And he won an Oscar for writing The Usual Suspects, which Brian directed.
Right.
And that he parlayed that into more of a directing career.
Right.
He had a film that he'd written about Alexander the Great, which was sort of his dream project.
Mm-hmm.
And he was trying to get that set up to direct. But there were certain, I guess, stipulations, you might say, that he wanted as a director that were hard to win for your first film.
Right, from the studio.
Right. And there was no way to make that film without studio backing. It was huge. And word got out that he was developing this. Oliver Stone developed one as well at the same time, and they ended up out of the gate, and it kind of shut down Chris's film. At the same time, you know, he was talking with Benicio del Toro one day about the trouble with Alexander, and Benicio was like, "Nah, they want you to do a crime film, man. They don't want this history. They want the crime film." And so Chris was like, "Fine, they want a crime film. I'll make a crime film so that they'll never ask me for another one."
Oh.
And that was the way the gun.
Wow.
And so he was like, "I'm just going to write the crime film to end all crime films for Chris McQuarrie." You know?
Wow.
And, you know, the plot of the film is two down-on-their-luck criminals kidnap a pregnant woman who's carrying the surrogate child of a gangster.
Right.
And it's pretty nihilistic. It's pretty angry.
Yeah.
It's, you know, in a way, it's... I suppose you could look at any film as a veiled algorithm for the film industry. You know, if you look at sort of the desire to make an artistic film as the baby in the film.
Yeah.
And then you look at the criminals as sort of artistic, independent-minded filmmakers. You look at the mafia and the gangster as the studio system, you know.
Well, recently Jon Favreau made a movie, Chef, and I think that's a perfect allegory, too. It's about a guy who's sick and tired of working in the big business restaurants, and he opens up a food truck because he wants to do something small.
Right.
And you know, he's a director of Iron Man. And
Yeah.
So you see where it's...
Well, you know, when you watch the bit they did he did a thing with Tony Hawk on MTV, and they were talking about Iron Man 2, and how they had to go into production without a script, and he was just like, "I'm never doing this." And you could tell it was sort of... it was exhausting him, you know what I mean? Really? So I can see why, you know.
Chef feels like it was born of that. So it's a similar thing, yeah.
Right, so Way of the Gun was a tough sell to begin with. On top of it, there was a conflict over whether to market it as sort of from the guy who wrote The Usual Suspects. The feeling being if you play up Suspects, you sort of inadvertently promise the audience some kind of twist in the film.
Yeah, an M. Night Shyamalan film.
Right, and Chris didn't want that. It's not a film built on a twist.
Right.
It's a film built on relationships and small revelations that occur in a group of people who are far too incestuous for their own good.
Yeah.
And so marketing was a challenge. The other thing, of course, which Chris and I have run into on all our films, is the conflict between our love of the 70s and that aesthetic and selling the film, making a film in that style and selling it for what it is, versus a marketing perspective, which is we're not really interested in what the film is. We're just going to sell it as a product.
Right.
And, you know, I understand that. Movies are expensive to make, and the studio has a right to recoup their investment. The challenge is doing that without pissing off the audience.
Yeah.
You know, for example, Jack Reacher, the marketing campaign for that used like an electric guitar and sort of music that sort of felt a little bit Mission Impossibly.
Yeah, it sold it very different than what the film was.
And the film was not that at all. No. The film is really a police procedural or a thriller, but it was kind of sold like an action movie.
Yeah.
You know, Way of the Gun, you know, the trailer was filled with like violent femmes and sort of like 90s grunge. And it was sort of sold like a Tarantino-esque hip now movie. Yeah. And in fact, what it really was more of like a Peck and Paw homage, you know, without any slow motion.
So on Mission Impossible 5, you guys, came together you did Rogue Nation with, you did Jack Reacher with Tom Cruise.
Yep.
With his production company, and that built on this, for this collaboration with him. And, but the thing what happened here is that it was supposed to come out in December.
Right.
And then the movie got pushed to July.
Right.
Did that completely F up your schedule? Or did you have enough time to do this in the way you wanted to? So
I had enough time to do what I wanted. The challenge in the change... Well, the schedule changed for a number of reasons.
Right.
Probably the biggest being the space movie that's coming out in 5 days.
Some small movie coming out.
It's a sequel to Return of the Jedi, actually.
Right, yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah. And, of course, everybody was... When that trailer came out, the first trailer, everybody was like, I think we're going to... Yeah. Especially since, this was an action film and the audience was maybe a similar demographic. Yeah. It's not like we were putting out, a biopic.
Yeah, or Love Actually, too, or something.
Right, So, but the other concern was that the fall had a lot of spy movies. We had Man from U.N.C.L.E., Bridge of Spies, Spectre, and we would have been fourth out of the gate. And we were just... Everybody was really... Tom and Chris were really proud and really excited of what they'd gotten.
Right.
They were in the finishing stretches of filming and really felt like we want the film to have the best shot it can have. Right. And moved the film. They made the decision... They started talking about moving it back in November of 2014. Mm-hmm. I think they announced the move in January or February.
Yeah.
And then... that meant instead of moving to London in May to start working on the score, I just moved in February. But I had sort of kept my schedule clear. I didn't really have anything lined up, so it was okay. And I still had the time I needed. Working with Chris takes a little longer than working with other directors because Chris doesn't use temp score.
So he gave you a clean slate for this. There was no music. You didn't edit to any music?
Nope.
Wow.
His feeling is that when you cut to music in the cutting room, you risk having a false sense of confidence in what you got on the set. And he's pretty brutal. I mean, he's brutal to himself as much as anybody else. Right. I did not get it. I need to recut it. I need to cut it till it works without music. I need to cut it till it works in their performances and their dialogue.
Wow.
And what happens with temp music on a Chris film is that eventually the film needs to be tested in front of an audience. Right. And you can't show it without music. The film will lay there and die. And so at that point, the music editor is brought in to build a temp score that matches the movie as closely as possible. So the film is not cut to music. The music is cut to the film.
So in some cases, because I go to those focus group screenings sometimes, so in some cases if they'll just put it in there, it doesn't suggest that they edited to it. They just make
Well, I don't know what other directors... Right. Most directors, that's not the case. Most directors cut to it.
Yeah.
But if you went to a test screening of Mission Rogue Nation, you would have heard a score that was built for that test screening.
Okay, cool.
And sometimes there are elements that they put in there that Chris likes and will say to me, there was a piece in the temp score that I don't want you to copy it, but, I think the tempo was right. And the feeling was right. So let's say we had been talking about doing something slower or different, and then he would say, having seen the temp, I think I'd like you to speed it up and change it, make it darker. You know what I mean?
Right.
What's nice about the way Chris works is that the film itself has its own rhythm. The opening cue to American Beauty was like an editor's favorite for years. And you would see movies, any movie that sort of had a family in it, the establishment of the family in the film was temped with American Beauty. And they all had the same rhythm. You could have taken the score from any of those scenes and interchanged it with another score from another movie temped with the same music, and they all would have fit.
Wow.
And so you ended up with every movie kind of feeling the same. It was very subtle. It's sort of subconscious. But you're like, this doesn't feel different. You know what I mean? And what's nice about Chris's films is that they feel different. You watch it and go, I don't feel like I've seen this before. And I think some of that is that sense of rhythm.
Right. And your score did stand out, I think, in its own way, of course, for Rogue Nation. But when you guys started, were there talks about, okay, do you even look, like, what did Hans do? What did Danny Elfman do? What did Giacchino do? Are we going to do something in the kind of dovetailing from kind of how Giacchino stylized it, or do you want to have its own thing completely in its own bubble? I mean, how was kind of that approach for that?
I had seen all four when they came out.
Right.
When I got the gig, I sort of said, I don't want to watch them if I can help it.
Right.
I'd really rather not.
Yeah.
I was very comfortable going back and looking at the TV show.
Right.
As much as the TV show... as much as the TV show as Chris and Tom wanted.
Right.
When I got the job, I was flown out to London during production to help supervise the shooting of the opera sequence.
Right.
Because they needed a music person on the set. And it was during that first trip that, I had my first chance to talk with Tom about music for this film and talk with Chris about it. And the message I kept getting from both of them was retro and percussive. Mm-hmm. And so when I got back to LA after that first trip, I started doing work, against rough cuts of certain scenes. I started doing work at the piano. I started sketching out ideas. And I sort of came to a conclusion that I wanted to try to write a score that Lalo could have recorded in 1966 when he did the pilot.
Wow.
And I just thought that would be a cool way to keep the thing retro like Chris and Tom wanted without it feeling like a pastiche.
Right.
So I could use any techniques I wanted. Like
right.
Lalo wasn't necessarily using a violin bow on a gong. Mm-hmm. But he could have.
Yeah.
That equipment existed. Whereas I didn't want to use like Stylus and Ableton Live and Omnispheres because that was not a texture that would have been available to him at all in those days. So I liked what Danny and Hans and Michael had done. I liked they'd all tried different things.
Right.
And
they're all different too.
I thought they were all successful in their own way.
Yeah.
Another thing that I seem to recall Chris saying is that we're not really making a sequel to those movies. We're making a continuation of the TV show. And so I really felt like what they did in the show is what I wanted to reflect more than what had been done in the previous movies. Right. And the other thing, just from a personal point of view, is I didn't want to rip them off. And I knew if I studied those movies too closely, I'd pick up things and I go, that was cool what he did there. I'm going to do that in my movie.
Right. And even subconsciously you might have done
right.
That,
and, if I was going to do that, I would much rather have done it based on what Lalo did in the beginning than what these guys were doing in the films.
Years ago, yeah. So you ended up working with probably one of the most recognizable themes in music history, film and television history. And I talked about this with Lauren a little bit when the first episode we did this for Terminator. I mean, he had to deal with that thing, and when I met Thomas Newman and talked about Bond and that theme, and a lot of the responses were, "Oh, we just put that thing over here, and it's its own thing." But it seems like for you embraced Lalo's thematic stuff and really built that into the DNA of your score. You didn't treat it as a little special treat every now. It kind of felt like a huge part of your sound. I mean, how did you approach utilizing?
Well, my main concern was that I'd seen a number of films, contemporary reboots, remakes, new sequels to franchises with popular themes.
Right.
And it had been a case where the original composer didn't come back. And the composer that was brought on did their own thing.
Right.
And then they sort of paid homage to the original.
Right. Yeah.
Almost as if it was a hit record. And they just dropped it in the movie as a hit record.
Right.
Maybe the most glaring example in terms of the contrast would have been GoldenEye. Which, nothing against Eric Sarabi, but his score was very synthesizer-y, textural.
Very different than what...
And then when the tank sequence came in, they sort of dropped in the orchestral... That
was against his will.
Well, I mean, and again, I'm not, I'm just saying, and that contrast I found very sort of jarring.
Yeah.
And that's happened again in other films since then.
Right.
And I just didn't want it to feel like I didn't want a big contrast between my music and the Mission Impossible theme.
Right, so you couldn't pick it out,
Partly because I didn't want to be accused of being, lame compared to how great Lalo is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I really tried as hard as I could to make it all the same level of quality.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Similar with the Puccini, you know what I mean? I didn't want it to feel like, oh, here's this masterful opera and then this sort of schlocky score that they chucked in on either side of it. You know what I mean? So I worked really hard to make the thing feel cohesive.
It worked. So.
Well, so my way of doing that was to just sort of pretend that I wrote those themes. I gave myself permission to pretend I wrote those themes.
Right.
And I scored it as if... Another big influence on me in terms of sequel scoring has been John Williams. His scores for the Jones sequels and the Star Wars sequels and prequels. Right. And the way that the musical language, the vocabulary that he built, if you look at every character's theme as a word, he doesn't sort of plunk in the exact same sentence in every movie.
Yeah.
He uses the words to write new sentences.
Right.
And that's what I wanted to do. So in the way that he would hint at Darth Vader's theme in the prequels, I wanted to do with Lalo's themes. And part of the way of doing that is to figure out what are the recognizable bits of those themes and how much do I need to give the audience in order to sort of clue them in. Mathematically speaking, there's not a lot of Lalo in the score when you really break it down and you go through and look at the number of notes I wrote in the score and the number of notes Lalo wrote. Really, except for the main title and the curtain call, there are no direct, full-on quotations of the theme in the film.
It feels like it's there, ever present throughout, which is...
Well, what I did was I sort of said, okay, he's got this sort of syncopated rhythm. Yeah. Well, I can do a theme and variations on that syncopated rhythm. Now it's new material, but I've started there, so it feels like it's sort of similar. You know what I mean? But if you actually sit down and look at it, you go, "Oh, I see. He's changed it. It's not the same."
And then it after the first two, kind of maybe it'll change a bit. Yeah.
Right. Or it's in 4/4 instead of 5/4 or 7/8 or 6/8 or whatever. You know what I mean? Or it's upside down, or it's stretched out, so it's 4 measures long instead of 2 measures long. You know what I mean?
Right.
I gave myself permission to sort of play games with it. And, do little tricks.
Right.
Sometimes, I would have a theme, and the last 3 notes of the theme would sound like the first 3 notes of the Mission Impossible theme. So there's a scene where Brandt is... Jeremy Renner is talking to Alec Baldwin, Hunley, on the phone, and it plays his theme, and then the last 3 notes are the Mission Impossible theme. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I sort of will tie the two together.
Right.
And again, it was just, I didn't want it to feel like Joe Kraemer, Lalo Schifrin, Joe Kraemer. You know what I mean?
Right.
So if the whole thing sounds, hopefully I elevated the Joe Kraemer without diminishing the Lalo Schifrin.
You did.
So anyway, that was the philosophy behind the approach.
Okay, that's how I took it from it. So it's pretty awesome. I don't know if you ever I don't know who wrote the score for it, but there was an N64 Mission Impossible game.
Oh yeah?
And it reminded me a lot of the way you approach this one.
Wow, I'll have to dig that up. I've never played it. I don't know it.
It's the history behind it. They had the rights for it, and the guys lost the rights because there really hasn't many Mission Impossible games.
Right. That'd be fun to do a game. Yeah. I'd love that.
So it's looking up. You can look up gameplay on YouTube.
Yeah.
It's fun.
That's fun. I'll check that out. But it's all sort of general MIDI, right? Like it's that N64 MIDI sound rather than
full
orchestra.
Yeah. But
orchestral.
The way they utilize the themes and the way kind of they wove it into the... it reminded me a little bit of the way you approached it. Yeah.
It's very much like how Williams does sequels.
Right.
He owns those themes. He wrote them, so he gives himself permission to do whatever he wants with them.
And as the composer of a Mission Impossible film, you should be able to utilize that.
I gave myself permission.
Right.
Which is why I want to do a Star Wars movie.
Well, I mean, the door's open, hopefully. You got... Desplat is now the first composer who's going to be doing a Star Wars film.
Live action, yeah.
Live action.
Well, I guess, yeah. I mean, Peter Bernstein did the Ewok movies.
Right.
Kevin Kiner did Clone Wars. But yeah, Desplat's the first one doing... Or Desplat. It's the first one doing the live action Star Wars movie.
The main canon one,
yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, Disney certainly paid enough for the license. I suspect they're going to be making a lot of these movies, and I hope eventually.
Well, I think the idea is 2 a year, similar to Marvel.
Yeah.
I think a main canon one and then a side one. I think.
Right.
So
there's a lot of content.
Yeah.
It's going to need to be scored.
Fingers crossed. Looking back at any one of your projects or anything, are you kind of type of guy who would catch it on TV and go, shit, I should have done something different. I wish I could have changed that. Or are you is it completely exited your head once it's finished and it's like, yep, that's what it is and that's what it will be forever? Or do you kind of go like, well, it could have been fun if... Are you a what if person or a that's done?
That's a good question. I would say, if you'd have asked me this a year ago before I did Mission, I would have told you that I was frustrated because I felt like I was capable of a certain kind of work and a certain degree of sophistication in my work that I hadn't had an opportunity to display yet.
Right.
Mission has been supremely gratifying in that I was finally able to sort of write deft, action-driven music with frenetic ostinatos and brassy crescendos. That's sort of, as a kid, what I loved about Raiders and Superman and Star Wars. I was able to bring some of that with my own voice to a film, which I've been dying to do, and I finally got the chance. So, having had a chance to do that, I can now look at work like Way of the Gun and Jack Reacher and a lot of the television work I've had to do using samples and say that's all a step in the ladder to Mission Impossible. Whether I wish I'd done differently or not, it's done. It's out there, so I can't really change it. It'd be fun from a certain... There's a part of me that would love to sort of update my work on Way of the Gun and do a new recording of it. Not as a replacement for the original, but as sort of like an enhancement. To actually re-record it. We were compromised in a lot of ways on Way of the Gun, both by my relative experience in the business and our budget and our schedule, and sort of with the experience I have now to be able to revisit that and re-record it. But by the same token, I wouldn't do that for the film. I wouldn't do that to replace the score in the movie. It would just be to have like a CD, a new version to listen to.
And I think John Powell actually, I talked to him and he had that idea. He wants to go back and revisit some of his older movies and re-record a suite.
Maybe that, what's it called? Like the Reavers by John Williams or the Cowboys. Now those original scores are very much rooted in the recording sound of the time they were made. But his Boston Pops versions of those are much more contemporary sounding. So that's an example. I listen to Way of the Gun now, and I don't know who I was when I wrote them anymore. Does that make sense? Like,
you don't
I suppose
the person who wrote
in the same way, maybe if you were to go back and read, like if you ever went to summer camp in grade school and you were to go read a letter you wrote home to your parents and go, I don't know who this kid is that wrote this thing. You know what I mean?
So much
or maybe college, where it's a little more articulate. But Way of the Gun to me, I think I would never decide to solve this problem that way. Today, I would solve it in a totally different way. Not better or worse, just different. So part of me sort of admires the different approach I took back then. And part of me goes, I wonder, or if I was given the same situation today, I wonder what I would do. I don't really have regret. I don't look at Way of the Gun and go, oh, I wish I'd done it differently. There's occasionally a few things where... I shouldn't say occasionally. There are often things when I go back and listen to stuff later, I go, oh, now that I've got some time between me and that project, I wish I'd modulated here. I left myself in the same key for a minute too long. You know what I mean? Things like that. But when you do a movie, you don't just sort of do it and it's done. It goes through so many other people who chip away at it and improve it, and change it, that if it gets to the stage and gets to the audience, the way how it got to the audience has gone through so many steps of approval by different people that it's kind of hard for it to be totally awful. Especially if you're not like an auteur. It's very difficult for it to be totally awful. Unless everybody you're working with just can't see the forest for the trees. You know what I mean? Or if you're working with somebody who has so much power that they don't have to listen to anybody else. You know what I mean?
So let's talk about, you scored one of the biggest action movies of the year. Summertime, that was a big summer movie. And action is kind of one of the most popular genres, I would say. What do you think is the state of action music in general? In terms of, we have like superhero movies now, they're kind of coming out our ears, and these big franchises, and a lot of things is about getting quickly done and using different techniques, whether it's electronic, synthetic, orchestral. You went full orchestral. You went kind of big, bold that way. But what do you think of the state of maybe not even action music, but the state of music in terms of big budget studio making these days?
Specifically in the case of Rogue Nation, the score was entirely acoustic. There were no electronic instruments of any kind in the film at all. We did use computers to edit the various takes together, which gave us some options that Lalo wouldn't have had in 66. But if you had enough time, you could have recorded this score in 66 and it would have sounded essentially the same.
Right.
Action music today, well, film scoring today.
Right.
Sorry. Let me gather my thought about how I want to say this. Film music has always been a reflection of the time it was made in.
Right.
The scores of the 40s sound like the 40s.
Right.
The scores of the 60s sound like the 60s. Sometimes it's the fidelity, a mono orchestra with no reverb sounds like the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Right,
you know what I mean? A lush surround sound orchestra sounds like the 80s and into the 90s. A live orchestra with a serious synthesized component really sounds like the 90s and 2000s. You know what I mean?
Right.
And what we've seen is an evolution of a sort of homogenized sound that is neither purely orchestral nor purely synthesized.
Right.
And that seems to be what's sort of in vogue these days.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
I think a lot about the sort of magic ratio of 85 and 15. That, things tend to happen in that sort of division. 85% of computer users are PC, 15 are Mac. 85% of the population drive economy cars, 15% drive luxury cars. It seems to be one of those things, like a golden ratio, that permeates a lot. And I think that, 85% of the movies made these days want that sort of homogenized sound where it's clearly live players and it's clearly they're mixed with samples.
Right.
So you've got horns that sound like 14 live players and a sample of 14 horn players playing a monophonic tune over chords played by a gigantic string section that is both live and samples.
Right.
Underscored with a giant electric taiko drum that you can't tell if it's acoustic or a sample, hitting every cut, maybe a loop, maybe there's electric guitar in there, That's a sound that I think is very in. It's been in for a while now, and it's sort of still the sort of go-to sound for movies.
Do you find yourself having to adapt to that, or being forced to adapt to certain sounds as a composer? If you're not working with someone like Chris, and they're like saying, "Oh, we want this sound, Joe. You have to make this sound." Is it? I would
say that the nature of my career has been that the biggest films I've done have been with Chris.
Right.
The other films I've done have mostly been independent features or television work where budget has necessitated has taken out the option for live orchestra, which means it's all synthesizer. Whether it's sampled instruments or synthesized tones, it's samples, it's electronic.
Right.
And it's much harder to create a hybrid acoustic-electric sound if you're not using any acoustic instruments.
Right.
You sort of create a phony acoustic-electric sound using electric versions of acoustic instruments. Long way around to this. For whatever reason, the work that I've done with Chris has sort of become my identity as an A-list composer.
Yeah.
My identity as a B-list composer is much more varied. There's a lot more electronic stuff in there. I have nothing against electronic stuff. Yeah. And I'm saying it was a cool idea to me to do Mission Impossible the way I did it.
Yeah,
but I don't think that's the only way to score a movie. I think Vangelis' score to Blade Runner is fantastic. You know what I mean? I think that what Soderbergh went with for Solaris, equally effective. Great, Drive,
Yeah.
The sound on Chris's movies has been predominantly orchestral, and that sort of creates a brand that Joe Kraemer does retro orchestra.
Right.
So I would imagine that based on those credits, if you were making a film and you wanted a more what are we calling that sound, that mix of electric and acoustic, if you wanted that sound, I might not be your first instinct because I haven't demonstrated that in the big movies that I've done. I have felt I don't want to say I felt compelled. I have eagerly pursued doing work like that in the smaller films that I've done. I did a thing called The Temp Agency with a really great director named Thomas Akimi, And that score is very much in that sort of Dark Knight, Zimmery, James Newton Howard vein, where they mixed electronics and acoustics.
Right.
But, you know, it's not a project with the scale and scope of Mission Impossible in terms of the marketing behind it.
Right.
So no one's seen, you know, obviously the number of people that have seen Mission dwarfs the number of people that have seen The Temp Agency.
Right. So those are the people who don't know you may or meeting you for the first time through Mission Impossible, your music, that's going to be the sound they associate you with.
You know, so I think, you know, and I think that what I did in Mission Impossible, which is probably, if you were to divide the industry into two camps, this is a broad generalization.
Right.
The John Williams camp and the Zimmer camp.
Yeah.
I'm in the John Williams camp. I would say Michael Giacchino's in the John Williams camp. I would say that Silvestri, you know, that's the sort of the orchestral guys, and then the synthesizer orchestral guys.
Right.
And that side is probably more like a lot of people who came up with Hans, like John and Mark, and people Junkie, Tom.
Yeah.
You know, Debney sort of straddles the two. You know, you know, I think Brian is more on the Zimmer side of things, Brian Tyler. And these aren't insults. These are just, you know, it's if you were to sort of generally, and I would say that 85% of the composers are on the Zimmer side and 15% are on the sort of more orchestral side.
Right.
And therefore, all of those people on that side are all competing for 15% of the jobs.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
That's true.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones doing the sound. So,
you know, and there's only 15% of the films are being made that need that kind of music.
Right.
You know.
So as a composer who is in the other side, it becomes a little bit more difficult to kind of poke your head through.
Well, the challenge on the other side, the challenge on the sort of Zimmer side, is that it's such an established sound.
Right.
And so many people who come up through Hans's tutelage, you know, by necessity of the job, have to sound like one sort of vision.
Right.
And then when you step away from that to establish yourself as an independent voice, it can be tough because you've devoted yourself to sounding that way. Right. And if that's not the way you want to sound on your own, you know, it's in a way it's like being typecast as an actor.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah.
If you were on a TV show as a soldier and you want to play a romantic lead, it might be tough to
convince the audience of the world.
Yeah. I
guess to wrap up, let's talk about what do you like to do outside of your day job of composer? what are your hobbies besides? I mean, do you like to?
I like to play video games.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I have a 12-year-old daughter. She's 13 now. Time flies. And she's into Minecraft, and she's playing Fallout 3 right now on her Xbox. I'm a horrible father. I'm letting her play Fallout 3.
I'm about 2 days into Fallout 4. So.
Yeah, I bought it. I haven't opened it yet. Christmas break, you'll probably get into a game. Either that or Witcher 3, what's the other one? Phantom Pain. Although I'm friends with David Hayter, so I'm a little torn.
I know.
Because
I started it, and I literally started about a few hours of it, and then I stopped because it got kind of boring with it.
Well, it's just they fired David and replaced him with Kiefer Sutherland.
Yeah.
And nothing against Kiefer, but it's just sort of being good friends with Dave for years.
Yeah.
It's
It's not.
I feel bad. In fact, David's one of the director. He had tried for years to get Watchmen made as a movie.
Right. He wrote the screenplay.
Well, he wrote a screenplay, and he actually shot a scene from it as a test for a director's reel.
Wow.
And I did the music for that.
Oh.
And so that was fun. And in the end, they couldn't set the deal up with him as a director, and it ended up being Zack Snyder, and his writer came in and did some rewrites on it, but then when it went into the Writers Guild and they went and looked at all the different drafts, David's name carried through. David also made a short film as a director, which I actually acted in, so I still act every now and then when somebody asks me to. I put zero effort into securing work as an actor, but if somebody asks me, you know, I'm such a ham, I'll go do it. You know what I mean?
That's good to know for me then.
Yeah, you know? You know, I love the Beatles. A few years ago, as a sort of nerd side project, I remixed all of their songs. It was an interesting project for me. The Beatles, you know, they recorded most of their material during the advent of stereo.
Right.
So they really mixed and mastered everything for mono.
Uh-huh.
The catch is, it's all in mono.
Right.
So, like, for years, we've been listening to these stereo mixes. What would happen is the Beatles would record, say, Paperback Writer. They'd mix it in mono, and all four of them would be there, push the bass up, push the guitar up, you know? Then they'd settle on a mix, and then that would be the mix.
Right.
Then a week later, while they were on tour, George Martin and Jeff Emmerich would go back in and remix it in stereo.
Right.
And the stereo mixes tended to be a little more conservative on the instrumental side, on the EQ side. They pushed the vocals a lot more forward. And they had what ended up being very unconventional panning, because nobody had sort of figured out what the rules of stereo were going to be.
Right.
So you'd have all the drums sort of folded into the right channel. The bass would kind of be floating around. You know, another weird, because it was all 4-track recording, what you would have is 1 and 2 could be panned individually.
Yeah.
3 and 4 was just a knob that said width. And all it did is control, like, how far left and right the image was. So you'd end up with things sort of floating at 10 and 2. This is all very nerdy. Right. In any case, it was fun for me because I went through and remixed everything so that the drums and bass were locked in the center.
Oh, okay.
Which really brought Paul and Ringo's performances as drummers and bassists to the forefront. And
you did this for the entire catalog?
I did this for the entire catalog.
Wow.
Well, to what I could.
Right.
You know, the first album is essentially just a mono album and what they call twin track, which is one track is voice, one track is instruments. I put the instruments in the center, and then I created sort of a fake stereo vocal track, you know, using sort of the same kind of plugin that Capitol would use when they would make fake stereo records back in the 60s. But once you get into, like, Rubber Soul and Revolver, even Ticket to Ride, you know, Help, Hard Day's Night, you can open things up a little more. And I didn't feel compelled to preserve the original sound of it in the sense of, I wasn't religious about it. I was like, I just want to make it sound good.
Right.
And if that means it sounds a little different than the original, you know, I just didn't add anything to it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Wow.
So it was an interesting side project. The other thing I'll do a lot is I'll study, you know, other composers' scores.
I couldn't help by looking at this pile over here.
Yeah,
You can't see it on camera, but it's a stack of a lot of John Williams.
Williams' conducting scores. It's some of the Hal Leonard stuff, and then some other more movie-specific stuff, which I've been able to look at for studying purposes. And I'll do mock-ups of that stuff, and that helps me get familiar with my sounds and how I can sort of articulate certain gestures on synth and make them sound as real as possible. And that becomes handy when I start writing an original score.
Right.
If I have something in my head, I sort of know, okay, it'll, even though it sounds kind of lame on synth, I know it'll sound right when it's live because I did the same thing with this John Williams cue.
Right. I used to work at Disney, and we worked in the Blu-ray department, the home entertainment. So when we start working on the Blu-ray, they just dump usually a lot of the sessions and stuff into a folder for the score and everything, because they build the menus and the bonus features around it. And sometimes you'd find the synth mock-ups of, say, The Incredibles. It would be fun. I was like, I gotta listen to those. And I listened to them, and it's just like hearing Giacchino's themes as a mock-up. It's so, I mean, they're funny because they're really bad sounding, but it's just kind of seeing the shape of the music.
But that's the strength or weakness of the library he's got.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, the mock-ups for Mission, there's no mistaking that they're mock-ups.
Yeah.
But they sound like the finished cue.
Right.
You know what I mean? I'm pretty proud of that. Like, I had a great orchestrator named Matt Dunkley, but I don't feel like I needed Matt to bail me out as a composer. Like, I've tried really hard to deliver something to the orchestrators that's as close to what it's going to be as I can get.
Right.
You know, I'm, again, like John Williams, you know, his sketches are the score.
Right.
It's not like he writes out a tune and puts chord symbols above it and gives it to Conrad Pope and says, here, orchestrate that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
His sketch is the whole thing worked out. Wow. But it's all on short score because it's just so unwieldy to write everything out on a giant score. You know what I mean?
Right. So another important question is, when are you seeing Star Wars?
Well.
Do you have your tickets yet?
I have tickets to the marathon at the El Capitan where they're showing all 7.
Oh, God. Are you doing that?
well, somebody had the tickets and they couldn't use them. They're like, you want them? And I was like, yeah. And now the more I think about the reality of sitting there and watching all 7, the main issue being B.O.
Yeah. And also, El Capitan's seats are like...
I know.
They're like the worst because it's like
it's an older theater,
yeah. It's just like they need to renovate those seats. They're not the most comfortable.
And the truth is, like, Blu-ray is so good.
Oh, yeah.
And I have, I've had opportunity to see all those movies with audiences as an adult in theaters.
Yeah.
So that's not as critical. But at the very least, I'll go there and see the new one because it's going to be in 3D Atmos with, I think, the laser vision. Maybe the new one's not in 3D yet. I don't know for that theater. But it's going to be that laser projection.
Yeah, the Dolby Vision.
Dolby Vision.
Which I haven't...
I think I'll probably end up seeing it Friday morning with my wife and my daughter because she's out for Christmas break by then.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing it. My boss surprised. He's like, we're skipping work. We're going to go see an 8 a.m. show Friday.
Yeah, so, I had somebody offer me a ticket to Thursday night, but I want to see it with my kid and my wife, so,
and
I'll wait.
Refreshed. Yeah. I have midnight readings. I get too tired.
See, I'm a night owl. I'd actually be more refreshed at 1 a.m. than I would be at 8 in the morning. Obviously I'm excited for it, the challenge I have to overcome as a personal Star Wars fan growing up is this is the first thing they've done without any George Lucas since the holiday special.
Yeah.
And we all know how that turned out. Now, obviously, I know Brian Burke, I know JJ because of Mission.
Right.
I have utter trust
in
what they're going to deliver. So I'm really sort of ribbing them a little bit by saying that. But there is a part of me that still feels like it's a little bit like Beatlemania or ELO.
Yeah.
It's none of the Beatles are in this Beatles album, Yeah. Yeah, Paul. Han Solo's back and Princess Leia and Luke, but George isn't around, and I know people have their issues with the prequels. I'm not a prequel hater. Again, to use the Beatles metaphor, I think the original 3 movies are the Beatles albums and the prequels are Wings.
Yeah.
And I don't know anybody who thinks Wings is better than the Beatles.
Right.
But, there's Wings songs I like. There's parts of the prequels I like, A
lot of people hate Phantom Menace. I really like Phantom Menace. I think I have the most problems with Attack of the Clones.
Me too. Yeah. That's interesting. I agree with you 100%. I actually think Phantom Menace is the most cinematic of the 3 prequels. It feels the most like a constructed film.
Right.
And I actually think that the backlash of Phantom Menace in some ways may have stung and changed some of what the direction would have been for the Clones and Revenge of the Sith.
Yeah.
And it'll be very interesting because for a long time I've sort of held the belief that when you looked at the series as a whole, Return of the Jedi was kind of an underwhelming finish to this story.
Yeah.
It was a great finish within the context of 4, 5, and 6.
Right.
It was fine, but as sort of the resolution to Darth Vader's story at the end of this whole saga, it was like it's a bonfire.
Yeah.
It's a campfire. What's nice is now that's not the ending anymore.
Right.
And the other nice thing is that what you'll have a 6-film arc about Anakin, and then it's sounding like, and I don't know, I have no inside information, but it's sounding like we're going to get kind of a 6-film arc about Luke.
Yeah.
And they overlap in the middle 3 films.
Yeah.
Which will be an interesting structure.
It'll be interesting. I can't wait.
I'm very excited, I have to say, too, I loved, and I don't know how it plays out in the film, but I loved the notion in the trailer that the exploits of the middle 3 films have sort of fallen into legend.
Right.
It's
all true.
Right. Yeah. And that the Empire or the remnants of the Empire sort of suppressed it all.
Right.
So.
Let me know how you think.
Yeah, they've tantalized us with a few clips of John's score, first one to be done in L.A.
That's right. There was a 60-minute. It aired
tonight. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I heard a few pieces from that. It was fun to see a lot of the guys who played on Reacher, a lot of the musicians who played on Jack Reacher playing on Star Wars now. And what was great was doing Mission Impossible. A lot of those people had played on the prequels.
Wow.
So.
That's awesome.
A funny story was when we were recording the score for Mission Impossible, my birthday fell within the round of sessions.
Yeah.
When they moved the film, we also lost the block of time we'd reserved in November and had to scramble to find dates in June. What we ended up with were 4 consecutive Sundays, which was a blessing and a curse. You know, we didn't get sort of the 4 days in a row where you build up a momentum.
Right.
Momentum. It was harder to build up a momentum because our days were spread out. The flip side was Chris was able to hear something, put it up against picture, and then give me very specific notes about what to change.
Right.
So we did have maybe more rewrites than we would have had, re-recordings than we would have had if we'd done everything in a block.
Right.
But Chris got exactly what he wanted, which was invaluable. As my birthday fell within this schedule, one day we were going to record a cue called The Syndicate, which is a very quiet cue, where Tom explains to Simon Pegg all the intricacies of the Syndicate and this whole plot. And without telling me, the music editor, John Finkley, and the orchestrator, Matt Dunkley, had put the main title to Star Wars on all the musicians' stands. So they were sending me click, and I'm going, this click feels fast for this cue. And then as I hit the downbeat, out of the orchestra comes the main title of Star Wars. And, my parents came to visit the session because, my dad, as an amateur musician, I knew he'd love to see Abbey Road. And I knew my mom would just love to see me. So he was filming it with his phone, and you can see I jumped back about a foot because it's just the sound.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, if you ever get a chance to conduct the main title to Star Wars, do it. Because it's the greatest sounding combination of instruments and notes that you'll ever hear. It sounds so good.
That's awesome.
And it's pointed right at your face. It's awesome. So that was great.
That's awesome.
That was a cool gift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Joe, I want to thank you for your time. It's been such a pleasure sitting here and talking with you. I'm probably going for hours of chatting.
Yeah. It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And, thanks.
All right. Tune in to All Access.